Okay, so now that we are a little bit more familiar with the interface and navigation, we can move on to manipulating objects within the 3D viewport. In this video, we're going to start learning some of the keyboard shortcuts that we're going to be using in Blender. So I've downloaded an app that will display my keystrokes down here in the bottom left corner. This is just to help you follow along with a visual guide of what I'm doing, because we're going to be using a lot of keyboard shortcuts going forward. So we have our starter cube here, and this is what is known as a mesh object. A mesh object is basically any 3D object that the computer renders using points in space called vertices to draw lines between called edges, which subsequently have faces drawn between them and are rendered opaque. I'll talk a bit more about vertices, edges, and faces when we get into mesh editing. That's a really technical definition of a mesh, however. So in layman's terms, a mesh is basically any solid object that compromises the stuff in our 3D space. Everything that we model in this course is going to be a mesh object. It's anything that isn't something like a camera or a light or a non-solid data type. Mesh is often referred to as geometry, so you may hear me use those terms interchangeably. We're going to start by transforming the default cube. Transforming in the world of 3D graphics is just a way of collectively referring to the location, rotation, and scale of an object in 3D space. Press N on your keyboard to bring up the sidebar. Under Item, Transform, you'll see that this panel contains all those pieces of information of location, rotation, and scale, as well as the dimensions of this object in real-world space and real-world units, which is driven by this scale value here. So we want to move this mesh around in our scene. This is easy. All we have to do is select the cube by left-clicking on it. The selection will be represented by this green highlight around the edge here. So once it's selected, press G as in grab, and now you can see that when I move my mouse around, the cube moves with it. Very cool. To drop the cube into a new location, simply left-click again when it's in the position that you want it. To drop the selection and cancel the operation, while you're moving around after pressing G, right-click, and it will snap back to its original position. To rotate an object, select it by left-clicking, then hit R as in rotate, and move the mouse to manipulate the object. Left-click again to confirm the rotation. To scale an object, select it by left-clicking, hit S as in scale, and move the cursor away from the model to scale up, and move the cursor towards the object to scale down. Once again, left-click to confirm the new scale. I'd just like to make a couple of quick additional points about scale. In the world of 3D graphics, the size of something is referred to as its scale. And scale works as a decimal system. When you add a new primitive object, like so, it will have a scale of 1 in all directions, in X, in Y, and in Z. The default cube primitive is added to the dimension with a scale of 1, but dimensions of 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, meaning it is 2 meters long in the X direction, 2 meters long in the Y direction, and 2 meters long in the Z direction. Now this is a scale of 1 for this object. By changing the scale to 2 in all directions, we now have a cube that is twice the size, and we can see that reflected here in the dimensions, where it says 4 meter by 4 meter by 4 meter, because 4 is twice of 2. Giving this object a scale of 0.5, we'll bring it back to 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters and a scale of 1, because we were just at a scale of 2 and we halved it by giving it a scale of 0.5. If we were at the default of 1 and gave this cube a scale of 0.5, you can see it reflected here, 0.5, and now the cube is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. And as a side note, I have my units for Blender set to meters. If it's not set to meters for you, don't worry. At this point, it really doesn't matter what units you're using here. But if you want it to be in meters, just for ease of following along, you can set the world units by coming into the properties editor on the right-hand side, going into scene properties, going under units, and you can set it here. So just make sure that the unit system is metric, the unit scale is 1, and the length is in meters. All this means is that now within the 3D viewport, one of these grid lines is equal to 1 square meter. So it's 1 meter this way and 1 meter this way. This is more important if you're going to be exporting your models into another program, but for now, just know that if you need to change the units in your scene, you can do so here. Okay, so getting back to transforming objects. All these keys on their own will perform the operation in all 3 directions. So if you wanted to scale an object uniformly, you can press X and see that it's getting larger, but it is not changing shape at all. It's still a cube because we have scaled it uniformly in every direction. But going forward, we're definitely going to need more control than that. We will often want to move, rotate, or scale in only one direction at a time. We can do this by pairing the grab, move, and rotate keys with either the X, Y, or Z key on the keyboard, depending on the axis. Remember that in Blender, the X direction is for left and right, the Y is for forward and back, and the Z direction is for up and down. So, for instance, if I wanted to move this cube a little to the left, I would select it, press G for grab, and then press X on the keyboard, and now you can see the movement is locked to this left and right axis, so I can move it a little to the left. If I wanted to rotate it around a single axis, I would hit R for rotate and then Z for the Z axis, and now we can see it is moving around the Z axis, which is drawn by that blue line that appears when you lock the axis. If I wanted to make this cube into a rectangle, I could scale it along a single axis. So I can select the cube by left-clicking, press S for scale, and Y for the axis I'd like to scale it along, and we can pull it along and elongate it along the Y-axis until it's more of a rectangle. You can also scale along 2 axes at once and lock the value of the third. So let's say I wanted to push this box back and to the right, but I didn't want it to lift off the ground at all. The ground being these grid lines here. All I would have to do is, with the box selected, press G for grab, hold Shift, and then press Z to lock the Z axis. And now we can move this along the floor here, move it back into the right, and we can see when we come into a more front view that it has not moved up or down at all. So whichever transform operation you want to use, plus Shift and then the axis key will lock the values in that direction. So if I wanted to make this box thinner but not make it any shorter along the Y, I would press S for scale, hold Shift and then press Y to lock the Y axis. And you'll see the other axes, which it is manipulating, are being drawn on the screen. And when I scale it in, you'll see that the box gets thinner, but doesn't lose any of the length along the Y-axis. Additionally, if you need to be really precise about how much you moved something, like say you wanted to rotate an object exactly 45 degrees, you can change these properties manually in the sidebar here. You could type 45 into the X and it would rotate it 45 degrees, 90, rotate it 90, etc. Or it is much quicker to do so with this keyboard shortcuts. Which we can do by pressing first the transform key that we wish to use. Let's say R for rotate, and then the axis we wish to rotate it along, Z for the Z axis. And then simply before we left click and confirm, we just want to type 45. Now this will rotate it exactly 45 degrees from where it was. So again, that's rotate Z 45, and you can see that this property has been changed up here to 45. And of course, for rotation, if you wanted it to rotate the other way, you could do so by just reversing the direction. So R for rotate, Z to lock the axis, and then minus 45 to rotate it the other way. If you're having some difficulty remembering trig, these numbers might be making you a bit queasy, but just remember that when you're working on a 3D grid or even a 2D grid, the sign in front of the number will inform the directionality of the mesh or the operation. So, for example, start with a new cube here, just so it's easier. Right now we are at a location rotation of 0, but if we pressed G for grab, we wanted to move it along the X axis, we could do so manually by saying 2, and it would move it 2 units, 2 meters along the X. If we wanted to move it the other way, we could do the same thing, G, X, -2. We'll move it in the negative direction. Remember that this point here at the center of the world, where all 3 axes intersect, represents a location of 0. So this location, as driven by this green dot, which we'll talk about more in a minute, is at a location of exactly -2 meters from this point. Now, Blender does have a gizmo. I believe it is even on by default. But if it is not on for you, all you have to do is come up here to the top right-hand corner of the screen and make sure this button that says Show Gizmo is on. Now, if this is enabled and you're still not seeing a gizmo on your object, just drop down this arrow here. This arrow here, and just make sure Move is on. This will make the gizmo appear on your object. So a gizmo is just this little arrow manipulator that allows you to transform an object by clicking and dragging these arrows rather than learning the keyboard shortcuts. I personally think that it is faster to use the hotkeys, but that being said, the gizmo is used in a lot of other 3D applications, so if you were familiar with something like Unity, this might be familiar to you already. And then if you enable Move, Rotate, and Scale under the Viewport Gizmos drop-down, you can do all of these operations. The arrows, of course, being for moving the object, the circles being for rotating, and the squares for scaling. Now, you may notice that even though I have this cube rotated at an angle relative to these axis lines, the arrows on the gizmo are still matching the direction of our world axis. This is what is called global space, and it refers to the orientation of this entire empty scene. The rotation of the scene cannot be changed because it is the basis for which we describe how objects within it are rotated. But what does that mean practically? Practically, if we have this cube rotated relative to our world space, something like that, if our transform orientation, our gizmo, is in global space, that means it would perform these transform operations according to the direction of the world. So if I wanted to make this cube into a rectangle now, with this rotation applied, I would hit S, Y, the same way, and O. That's not really what we wanted, was it? Because you'll see it's scaling along this line. And it just becomes really distorted. Now, we can definitely still make this a rectangle without changing the rotation back to match the world. All we have to do is set our transform orientation into what is called local space. Local space is basically using the rotation of the object relative to that of the world space to define the direction of this XYZ axis. So when an object is rotated like this, if you go up to this top bar, up here where it says global, click the drop down, you can change the transform orientations to local space. You'll now see that the gizmo arrows have snapped and according to the rotation of the cube. So now, if we scale along the y-axis, it's going to scale properly because it is using the rotation of the cube and rotating it along its local y-axis. However, a much quicker way to switch between local and global space on the fly without having to come up here and change it from the menu. If you want to perform any transform operation in local space, all you have to do is hit the transform hotkey for the operation you want to perform, and then double press the axis button. So to scale this along the Y without changing it here, we would just hit S for scale, Y once for the Y-axis, and then instead of clicking, we're just going to hit Y again, and it's going to transform into local space, and we can scale it properly and click to confirm. This shortcut works for all transform operations, including move and rotate. So if I wanted to move this along its local X, which would be this direction, I would hit G for grab, X for the X axis, and then X again to switch it into local space. Click to confirm. Same thing for rotation. If I wanted to rotate it along its local axes, I would hit R for rotate to give me the rotation tool. Let's say X for the X axis globally, and then X again to change that to the local axis. Any of these transform operations you performed is stored in memory and can be undone using Control-Z. I believe Blender saves something around 50 steps in memory, and I believe you can configure that in the preferences as well, but 50 steps is plenty. You can redo any of the undone operations by pressing Control and then Shift and then Z, and it will redo the operation. So let's say you move an object, you transform it however you wish, and then you decide that you really need it to be back at the center of the world. But maybe you've done some other operations and you can't undo back through it. You can quickly clear the transforms by using the Alt key combined with the transform operation key. So holding Alt and pressing G will clear the location. It will reset these values to 0 and snap the mesh back so its center point is at 0, 0, 0 on the grid. You can also do this with Alt-R for rotation. This value has now been reset to 0, and Alt-S will reset the scale. So now we have returned to our default cube with no transforms applied. You could also do this manually by pulling up the sidebar here, again, which is accessed by pressing N on the keyboard to toggle, and just manually typing in 0 for these values.